February 19th, 1959. Malton, Ontario. Chief Test Pilot Władysław Spud Potocki climbs into the cockpit of Avro RL-202 and takes it to Mach 1.75, a routine test flight. He lands, fills out his report, and drives home. The next morning, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker rises in the House of Commons in Ottawa and ends it in 14 words. All work is to be stopped forthwith, and no further costs are to be incurred. At the Malton plant, a sprawling complex adjacent to what is now Toronto Pearson International Airport, Crawford Gordon, president of Roe Canada, walks to the factory loudspeaker. "Notice of termination," he says. "There will be no work for you." 14,000 people go home that day without jobs. A further 15,000 workers across 650 subcontractor companies follow in the days after. Roe Canada, by 1959 one of the most technically advanced aerospace companies operating anywhere outside the United States, effectively ceases to exist. Then comes the part that still makes aviation historians pause. 5 completed aircraft. 1 more sitting on the ramp ready for its first flight. 4 nearly finished airframes in various stages of assembly. None of it stored, transferred, or offered to an ally who might fly them. All of it cut apart with blowtorches. The engines destroyed, the blueprints ordered shredded, every jig, every tool, every piece of manufacturing apparatus eliminated. A Hamilton junk dealer named Samuel Lax purchases the remains at 6.5 cents per pound. The aircraft was the Avro CF-105 Arrow, at the moment of its cancellation the most advanced interceptor aircraft in the Western world. Canada built it from first drawings in 5 years, hit Mach 1.96 in testing, and then spent 5 months destroying every trace of it. The Arrow wasn't killed by a better plane. No better plane existed. It wasn't made obsolete by emerging technology. The Soviet bomber it was built to intercept, the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear, is still flying operational missions today, still intercepted by manned fighters more than 65 years after Canada destroyed the one aircraft purpose-designed to catch it. The Arrow was killed by an ideology. That ideology struck British aviation in March 1957 and Canadian aviation in February 1959. It was wrong within a decade, but it was never wrong enough to give back what it had taken. And the engineers Canada discarded went on to design Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo for the country that had lobbied hardest against the Arrow's survival. Canada cancelled the Arrow because it couldn't afford the future. Its engineers went ahead and built that future for everyone else. Avro Canada Limited was established in 1945 at Malton as a wholly owned subsidiary of the British Hawker Siddeley Group, taking over the former Victory aircraft plant. By the early 1950s, it had grown into something Canada had never previously possessed: a vertically integrated aerospace manufacturer capable of operating at the global frontier. The CF-100 Canuck, Canada's first domestically designed and produced jet fighter, entered RCAF service in 1952, demonstrating that the country could take a military aircraft from concept to frontline deployment entirely within its own borders. Avro Canada had also flown the C-102 jetliner on August 10, 1949, before the de Havilland Comet's commercial debut, making it arguably the world's first jet-powered passenger aircraft to fly. Canada, by the time Arrow design work began in 1953, was operating at the absolute front edge of Western aviation. The Arrow demanded everything the company had. The RCAF's operational requirement specified an aircraft that, when an evaluation team toured American, British and French manufacturers in 1952, no existing or planned aircraft anywhere in the world could satisfy. 2 crew. Internal weapons bay. 5 minutes from engine start to 50,000 feet altitude. Not an incremental improvement over the CF-100. Something genuinely new. Designed to intercept Soviet bombers approaching North America from the Arctic. The workforce required to build it expanded accordingly. By 1958, Avro Aircraft and the Orenda Engines Division together employed 14,000 people at Malton. Supporting them were another 15,000 workers across 650 subcontractor companies, a Canadian aerospace industrial base that had taken a decade to build and would take one parliamentary announcement to destroy. Total economic exposure, approximately 29,000 jobs. Arrow RL-201 rolled out publicly at Malton on October 4, 1957. Avro had invited 13,000 guests. The Soviets launched Sputnik the same morning. Every camera turned skyward. Canada's defining industrial achievement shared its debut day with the start of the space age. A coincidence that, given what would happen to the engineers 2 years later, carries more irony than anyone at Malton could have imagined. First flight came on March 25, 1958. Janusz Zurikowski lifted RL-201 off the runway and climbed to 11,000 feet at 250 knots, deliberately cautious, entirely controlled. The aircraft handled precisely as designed. The test program moved fast from there. By April, it was supersonic. By the autumn, it was approaching Mach 2 on an engine that wasn't even supposed to be in it. What Canada actually built needs to be stated precisely, because the Arrow mythology has developed a habit of over-claiming in ways that invite equally over-claiming rebuttals. And the aircraft doesn't need over-claiming. The facts alone are more than sufficient. The Arrow Mark I flew on 2 interim Pratt & Whitney J75 engines, each producing 18,500 pounds of thrust with afterburner. Its highest recorded speed, achieved on November 11, 1958, during a climb at 3/4 throttle, was Mach 1.96 at 50,000 feet. Official RCAF maximum speed specification, Mach 2.0. Tested service ceiling, 53,000 feet. Combat radius, 261 nautical miles. All of that with borrowed engines. The intended power plant was the Orenda Iroquois, rated at approximately 30,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner, a thrust-to-weight ratio of 6.5 to 1 that contemporary engineering assessments described as unprecedented for a production turbojet. The Iroquois represented a generational advance in engine design. Contemporary accounts noted it was a greater leap over its predecessors and competitors than the Merlin engine had been over what came before it in the Second World War. Arrow RL-206, the first Mark II with Iroquois engines fitted, was sitting at Malton ready for taxi testing on the morning of February 20th, 1959. It never moved under its own power. The Mark II's projected service ceiling was 58,500 feet. Its projected speed exceeded Mach 2.5, theoretically limited by airframe heating rather than available thrust. That was the aircraft Canada was about to fly when Diefenbaker stood up in Ottawa. The Arrow's avionics system, the Astra fire control package and Sparrow missile combination selected by the RCAF was behind schedule and immature at time of cancellation. The resulting cost overruns were real. Fitting a mature weapons system to the Arrow's exceptional airframe was an available option. Nobody took it. Now the honest comparison, because certain corners of aviation commentary will fill any gap with the argument that the Arrow was already being surpassed. The F-106 Delta Dart reached Mach 2.3 at 40,000 feet, had a service ceiling of 57,000 feet, and could cover a combat range of 1,335 nautical miles. That last number is the Arrow's most significant operational weakness relative to its American contemporary. The F-106 outranged the Arrow Mark I by approximately 5-1. For an aircraft tasked with intercepting bombers across the continental United States, that range was operationally essential. The comparison favours the F-106 on range, full stop, and it's worth stating directly because Arrow advocates who skip past it invite the accurate accusation of selective data presentation. The context, though, matters. The Arrow's mission was the Canadian Arctic Approach Corridor, not the continental US interior. The RCAF specification called for a combat radius of 300 nautical miles on a normal mission. The Arrow Mark I's 261 nautical mile combat radius was close to that requirement. The Mark II's projected performance would have comfortably exceeded it. The Arrow's range was adequate for what Canada needed it to do. The English Electric Lightning comparison deserves equal precision. The Lightning F1, which entered RAF service in 1960, had a top speed of Mach 1.7 at 36,000 feet. The Arrow Mark I achieved Mach 1.96. On raw speed, the Arrow is faster, and there's no serious debate about it. The Lightning's famous intercept radius, even in its later, more refined marks, was approximately 135 nautical miles on afterburner. A 135 nautical mile intercept radius from a Canadian Arctic base covers essentially nothing operationally useful. The Lightning was a superb point defence interceptor designed for the relatively compact British airspace. Canada's geography would have strangled it. The Lightning argument is fundamentally an argument about operational maturity, not performance. The Lightning actually entered service, which the Arrow never did. That's a real distinction. An aircraft that flew operationally does things that a cancelled test program can't. But the reason the Arrow never entered service wasn't performance. It was a Friday morning announcement in the House of Commons. Before the politics can be prosecuted honestly, the threat the Arrow was built to meet needs to be stated correctly. Because previous coverage of this era has gone badly wrong on exactly this point. And the error doesn't strengthen the Arrow's case, it undermines it. The Soviet bomber force that NORAD was tasked with defeating in 1958 and 1959 consisted of 3 primary aircraft. The Tupolev Tu-95 Bear, a strategic turboprop that first flew in 1952 and entered Soviet service in 1956. The Tupolev Tu-16 Badger, a medium jet bomber. The Myasishchev M4 Bison, the Soviet Union's first turbojet strategic bomber, which appeared publicly at the 1954 Moscow May Day parade and spurred the bomber gap controversy in American politics. None of these aircraft were Mach 2 capable. None of them operated at 80,000 feet. The Tu-95 Bear had a maximum speed of approximately 500 to 575 miles per hour. Subsonic, Mach 0.82 in round terms. Operating at service ceilings between 33,000 and 39,000 feet, depending on load and variant. The Badger was transonic at best, around Mach 0.85, with a ceiling of 42,000 feet. The Bison reached 588 miles per hour at a ceiling of 41,000 feet. Large, nuclear-armed, subsonic aircraft flying at altitudes where a high-performance interceptor could engage them from a comfortable margin. The first Soviet aircraft that was genuinely supersonic, the Tu-22 Blinder, entered operational service in 1961. That was after Arrow RL-206 had already been cut apart with a blowtorch. The supersonic Soviet bomber threat that the missile ideology used to justify the Arrow's cancellation didn't exist as an operational reality when Canada destroyed the only aircraft capable of meeting it. They cancelled the right aircraft before the threat it was built for had even materialized. The Arrow Mark I, at Mach 1.96 and a 53,000-foot ceiling, was dramatically more capable than any Tu-95 flying at under 575 miles per hour at 39,000 feet would require. The Mark II with Iroquois engines would have handled the Tu-22 Blinder comfortably when it eventually appeared. The match between the Arrow and the real threat wasn't questionable. It was exact. The idea that killed the Arrow was articulated clearly and first in Britain. In March 1957, Minister of Defence Duncan Sandys tabled Command Paper No. 124 in Westminster, Britain's Defence White Paper. On April 16, 1957, he moved its formal parliamentary adoption. That this House approves the outline of future defence policy. The document's argument was stark. Nuclear deterrence, not conventional interception, was Britain's strategic future. Manned aircraft were being rendered obsolete by offensive and defensive missiles. Defence spending would be concentrated on nuclear weapons and the rockets to deliver them. Military personnel were to be cut from 690,000 to 375,000 by 1962. The British aircraft industry, which had been producing some of the most sophisticated jets in the world since the end of the war, was effectively told its future in military manned aviation was limited. Programme after programme was cancelled. The English Electric Lightning was the only interceptor to survive the White Paper's cuts. Any chance of a follow-on to the Lightning was specifically ruled out. Academic research on SANS identifies what one University of East Anglia paper calls nuclear belief systems, a genuine intellectual conviction that missiles had permanently superseded the fighter pilot. Sands held this belief with the certainty of a man who had seen a new strategic reality before anyone else had caught up. He was wrong. By 1964, the McDonnell Douglas Phantom had demonstrated the optimum manned fast jet of the era. Sands' framework was outdated within 7 years of its articulation. But in 1957, it felt like strategic clarity, and it crossed the Atlantic quickly. Canada's Joint Intelligence Committee produced an assessment in January 1958 titled The Threat to North America, 1958 to 1967. It concluded that by 1961, the principal Soviet threat to North America would come from intercontinental ballistic missiles, not bombers, and that there would be little justification for the USSR to increase bomber numbers or introduce new ones after 1960. That assessment was, as subsequent events confirmed, largely accurate. The Soviet Union did shift toward missiles. Nikita Khrushchev, in the wake of Sputnik's success, came to see ICBMs as a cheaper alternative to conventional weapons, and relegated the bomber force to secondary status. The intelligence was sound. What politicians chose to do with it was the error. Defence Minister George Perks formally requested Arrow cancellation from the Cabinet Defence Committee in August 1958, citing the ICBM transition as the primary justification. The CDC refused. The Arrow programme, Perks was told, would be reviewed on March 31, 1959. In September 1958, the CDC again deferred full cancellation, announcing that all financial commitments would be fully reviewed in 6 months, essentially kicking the decision to the scheduled spring review. Avro management, knowing the programme was under pressure, expected to make their case at that March meeting. The Diefenbaker government cancelled before either the CDC or Avro could make that case, and cancelled 5 weeks before the government's own scheduled review. No new intelligence finding in those 5 intervening weeks is publicly documented. No new cost analysis emerged. The Cabinet Defence Committee's own process was bypassed. The same month as the Arrow's cancellation announcement, Diefenbaker confirmed Canada's intention to acquire 56 Mach B missiles from the United States. The missiles came with a problem he appears to have underestimated. The Mach B required nuclear warheads to be effective, and acquiring those warheads would entangle Diefenbaker in a nuclear weapons controversy that eventually brought his government down. The replacement for the most advanced interceptor in the Western world was a missile system that, by February 1960, was so plagued by failures that the Canadian Parliament formally addressed the reported 6th consecutive test failure of the Mach B. The system was shut down in the early 1960s. The United States had the same strategic intelligence, the same ICBM build-up, the same argument from Sandy's intellectual circle. The USAF retained the F-106 Delta Dart regardless, because it had the budget depth and institutional will to maintain manned interception alongside missile defense rather than instead of it. The F-106 served until 1988. Canada's Arrow was blowtorched in 1959. The different outcomes came from the same strategic environment, which means the Arrow's cancellation was a choice, not an inevitability. American pressure existed, but operated indirectly. Secretary of Defence Neil McElroy explicitly asked Canada in August 1958 to focus on building components for American programs rather than the Arrow. His counterpart, Charles Quarles, told Defence Minister Perks directly that Canada didn't need the Arrow given American aircraft availability. American declassified records include defense-sharing discussions as part of the cancellation context. Washington benefited enormously from what followed. But no credible Canadian official record shows the United States ordering Ottawa to cancel. What happened was subtler. The US made clear it wouldn't buy the Arrow, wouldn't help fund it, and was offering trade arrangements for component manufacturing as an alternative. Canada's own strategic logic, shaped by genuine intelligence about the Soviet transition to missiles, then carried the decision the rest of the way. The official Cabinet Defence Committee records from 1960 cite the belief that the bomber threat had diminished as the stated reason. American pressure appears nowhere in official Canadian documentation. It was the context, not the cause. February 20th, 1959. The mechanics of Black Friday deserve their own accounting. Diefenbaker's parliamentary statement made minimal mention of the programme's escalating costs. The per-aircraft price had reached approximately $12.5 million, and the full development cost was heading toward $470 million by some accountings. Academic analysis suggests the cost argument was deliberately downplayed in the public announcement, because invoking it would have exposed the government to accusations of insufficient commitment to Canadian defence. The primary public rationale was strategic. Manned interceptors were becoming secondary to the ICBM threat. This was the Sandys argument, 23 months delayed across the Atlantic. In September 1958, Crawford Gordon, president of Avro, had secured a meeting with Diefenbaker that he believed would be his chance to make the Arrow's case directly. Gordon arrived, apparently, in a state of extreme agitation, incoherent, one aide reported, like a person demented. He pounded the Prime Minister's desk. Diefenbaker threatened to have him removed. Gordon understood that day what the outcome would be. When it came on February 20th, he walked to the factory loudspeaker himself. Notice of termination. There will be no work for you. 14,000 people. One announcement. One afternoon, the CDC had set a March 31st review as the formal decision point. Diefenbaker moved 5 weeks early. The cancellation circumvented the government's own established timeline. Avro executives, who knew the program was under threat and had been preparing their March case, were caught completely without recourse. There was no appeal process. There was no phased wind-down. The program ended on a Friday morning in the House of Commons, and within hours the factory was cleared. The cancellation was the decision. The destruction was the deliberate erasure. On March 26, 1959, 34 days after Diefenbaker's announcement, Air Marshal Hugh Campbell sent a formal recommendation to Defence Minister Perks authorising the destruction of the Arrow airframes, the Iroquois engines, the blueprints and the tooling. The stated justification was classified materials security, protection against Soviet espionage. A KGB agent operating under the alias David Sobolov, real name Brick, had confessed to the RCMP security service that he had been running a Soviet spy ring inside the classified Arrow program. The espionage was real. Whether it justified total physical destruction rather than secured storage is a different question, and nobody in authority appears to have asked it. Diefenbaker later claimed in his memoirs that he issued no such directive and was unaware that the pre-production models had been destroyed. The documented chain of authority runs from Campbell's recommendation to Perks' office, not directly from the Prime Minister's signature. Whether Diefenbaker was genuinely uninformed or found it convenient to be uninformed is something the surviving record can't resolve. What it confirms is that nobody stopped the order once it was issued. 5 completed Arrow Mark I aircraft, RL-201 through RL-205, the aircraft that had accumulated 66 flights and just over 70 total hours of flight time, were cut apart with blowtorches. Arrow RL-206, the Mark II that had never flown and was waiting for its first taxi run, was cut apart. 4 nearly complete Mark II airframes went the same way. All Iroquois engines were destroyed. Blueprints and tooling were ordered shredded. By July 1959, the work was complete. Samuel Lax, the Hamilton junk dealer, carted away what remained of Canada's aerospace future at 6.5 cents per pound. One nose section from RL-206 survived. It sits today in the Canadian Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa. Wind tunnel test models survived in collections, and in the basement of a man named Ken Barnes, a senior draftsman at Avro who apparently chose not to follow the destruction order, a set of Arrow blueprints spent decades in private storage. They were displayed publicly for the first time in 2020 at the Diefenbaker Canada Centre. The knowledge survived only because one man defied the order to eliminate it. That detail is more revealing than complete destruction would have been. The government ordered erasure. One draftsman, working alone, kept the record alive. The fact that the blueprints needed to be hidden in a basement to survive tells you everything about the intention behind the destruction order. This wasn't the routine disposal of a cancelled program's surplus materials. It was the systematic removal of the ability to reconsider. No future Canadian government could restart the Arrow. No ally could study it for partnership. No museum could restore it to flight. The decision was made permanent in a way that cancellation alone never would have achieved. On the morning of February 21, 1959, a significant fraction of the most capable aerospace engineers in North America were out of work. NASA was paying close attention. The Space Task Group, NASA's operational core, formed in the months after Sputnik, had an urgent need for people who could think about high-speed flight, thermal management, structural dynamics, and control systems at the absolute frontier of what was technically achievable. The Avro engineers were exactly that. Recruitment began within weeks of the cancellation announcement. 32 engineers from Roe Canada eventually joined NASA's Space Task Group. The group arrived in phases. Approximately 25 hired in an initial recruitment led by Jim Chamberlain, 6 more in the months following. About half were Canadian nationals. About half were British nationals who had been working at Avro Canada. Historian Manfred von Ehrenfried, writing in The Birth of NASA, notes that the US benefited greatly from Canada's loss, not just on Mercury, but on Gemini, Apollo, Skylab, and the space station that followed. They are known in NASA history as the Avro Group. Jim Chamberlain is the figure around whom this story properly turns. Born in Kamloops, British Columbia on May 23, 1915, Chamberlain had taken mechanical engineering degrees at the University of Toronto in 1936 and at Imperial College London in 1939. He joined Avro Canada in February 1946 and rose to become Chief of Technical Design for the CF-105 Arrow, the role where, according to Canada's Aviation Hall of Fame, his leadership produced engineering research and applied development techniques a generation or more ahead of those used by other aircraft companies at the time. When the Arrow was cancelled, Chamberlain led the initial group of 25 Avro engineers to NASA and quickly became one of Robert Gilruth's closest advisors. At NASA, he was appointed Chief Engineer for Project Mercury, working directly with McDonnell Aircraft to ensure spacecraft were built to specification, overseeing the final design of the capsule in which American astronauts first flew to space. He then designed the Gemini spacecraft from scratch and served as NASA's first project manager for Gemini, the two-man program that proved the orbital rendezvous and docking techniques that made Apollo possible. In 1961, while developing Gemini, Chamberlain proposed pairing the spacecraft with a landing module that could set a single astronaut on the Moon. The specific proposal was rejected, but it helped push NASA toward its eventual decision to use lunar orbit rendezvous as the Apollo architecture. Space historian David Baker later called Chamberlain probably one of the most brilliant men ever to work for NASA. He received 3 NASA Exceptional Achievement Medals. A minor planet, 14,148 Jim Chamberlain, is named for him. Canada Post issued a stamp commemorating him in 2019, 50 years after the landing. Owen Maynard was born in Sarnia, Ontario, on October 27, 1924. He came to NASA from Avro as a project engineer on Mercury, then transferred to the Apollo program, where he helped design the lunar module, the specific vehicle that touched down on the Sea of Tranquility on July 20, 1969. Maynard also developed the A through G mission sequence that organized Apollo's test program, from the first unmanned flights through to the lunar landing. The man who designed the spacecraft that landed on the Moon had learned his trade building Canada's supersonic interceptor. John Hodge, British-born, based at Avro, Canada before 1959, became an original flight director at NASA Mission Control, working alongside Chris Kraft and Gene Kranz through Mercury and Gemini. Carl Lindo, who had served as Arrow project manager at Avro, transferred to Boeing as project engineer on the Saturn S-1, the first stage of the rocket that sent Apollo missions to the Moon. Robert Lindley, Avro Canada's chief engineer, transferred to McDonnell Aviation in St. Louis to work on Mercury. Bruce Aikenhead trained NASA astronauts for 3 years before returning to Canada, where he contributed to the Canadian Canadarm program. These weren't peripheral contributors to programs run by others. Chamberlain designed Gemini. Maynard designed the lunar module. Hodge directed missions from the flight director's console. Lindo worked on the Saturn booster. The engineers Canada terminated on February 20, 1959, went on to build the hardware that put the first humans on the Moon a decade later. Canada received nothing in return. No technology licensing, no industrial partnership, no knowledge transfer. The engineers took their expertise to Houston, St. Louis, and Huntsville, and built the future of human spaceflight for the United States. Canada replaced its most advanced aerospace program with Mach missiles that failed their 6th consecutive test by February 1960. And with a fleet of second-hand F-101 Voodoos that the RCAF's own air staff had already judged inferior to the aircraft they were replacing. The total cost of the Voodoo and Mach purchases reportedly exceeded the full cost of the Arrow program. Canada paid more for less. The claim that the Arrow was killed by strategic necessity, that the January 1958 intelligence assessment was essentially correct, and that Diefenbaker was responding to genuine information, deserves direct engagement rather than dismissal. Because the intelligence was largely accurate. The Soviet Union did shift toward missiles. The bomber force was deprioritized. The JIC assessment proved broadly correct about the next decade's strategic trajectory. But the intelligence said the bomber threat was diminishing. It didn't say the threat was gone. The Tu-95 Bear entered Soviet service in 1956. It's still flying operational missions today, and its crews are still being intercepted by manned fighters from Norway, Britain, Canada, and the United States. The strategic calculus of 1958 was that the bomber was becoming secondary, not that the bomber was going away. Cancelling every manned interceptor capability on the basis of that assessment wasn't a conclusion the intelligence required. It was a conclusion politicians chose. Duncan Sands chose it for Britain in March 1957, under the conviction that missiles had made the fighter pilot permanently obsolete. He was proven wrong by 1964, when the Phantom demonstrated that manned fast jets still had decisive operational roles. Diefenbaker followed the same logic to the same conclusion in February 1959. Both men were working from the same intellectual framework. Both were proven wrong within a decade, And both managed to make their decisions permanent in ways that couldn't be reversed once the strategic picture clarified. The Avro engineers didn't make the bet. They built the aircraft they were asked to build, hit Mach 1.96 at 50,000 feet on 3/4 throttle with borrowed engines, and went home on a Friday afternoon without work. The aircraft they built would have outclassed the Tu-95 Bear with comfortable margin, would have handled the Tu-22 Blinder when it appeared in 1961, and would have given Canada an independent aerospace capability that the country has never again approached. 5 aircraft cut apart with blowtorches. A nose section in a museum in Ottawa. Blueprints in a man's basement, kept there quietly for decades because he understood what destroying them would mean. 32 engineers in Houston, building the moon program for the country that had undermined the Arrow's survival. Canada cancelled the Arrow because it couldn't afford the future. The engineers it discarded went on to build that future for everyone else. So sad, so avoidable. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. There are a lot more where this came from.